The ocean is excellent at keeping secrets. It is vast, unforgiving, and crushing. Down in the black, 3 miles beneath the surface, there is no light, no radio waves, and no mercy. The pressure is enough to turn steel into paper. For centuries, if you lost something down there, it was gone forever. God himself couldn't get it back. But in 1968, men were trying to play God. The Cold War was at its peak. The world was split in two. East and West, Moscow and Washington. Two giants standing in a room filled with gasoline, both holding matches, waiting for the other to flinch. The weapon of choice wasn't just the bomb, it was the submarine. Silent killers that could slip unnoticed off a coastline surface and erase a city in the blink of an eye. In February of that year, one of these silent killers left the Kamchatka Peninsula in the Soviet Far East. It was the K-129, a Gulf II-class strategic missile submarine. It wasn't the newest boat in the Soviet fleet. It ran on diesel engines, not nuclear power, which meant it was loud and smoky when it ran on the surface. But it carried something that commanded respect: 3 R-21 ballistic missiles. Each one carried a nuclear warhead capable of leveling a city the size of San Francisco. 98 men were on board. Young sailors, fathers, sons. They waved goodbye to the snowy coast of Russia, expecting to return in 70 days. They had orders to patrol a specific box of ocean north of Hawaii. They were part of the Soviet Union's nuclear deterrent, the iron fist meant to keep the Americans afraid. But they never made it to their patrol box. 2 weeks into the mission, K-129 was supposed to break radio silence, a standard check-in. A quick burst of code to let the fleet headquarters know they were alive and operational. The time for the check-in came. The radio operators in Kamchatka listened. They adjusted their frequencies. They waited. Nothing. Just the hiss of static. 12 hours passed, then 24, then 48. In the world of submarines, missing a scheduled check-in is the first note of a funeral march. Panic began to creep up the chain of command in the Soviet Navy. This wasn't just a missing boat, this was a missing nuclear arsenal. If the Americans had sunk it, this was an act of war. If the crew had defected, it was a catastrophe. If it had sunk on its own, it was a tragedy. By mid-March, the Soviets couldn't wait any longer. They launched one of the largest rescue operations in naval history. It was a chaotic, desperate scramble. From the deck of American surveillance ships, it looked like a frantic dance. Soviet destroyers, submarines, and trawlers flooded the North Pacific. They were pinging the water with active sonar, dragging sensors circling endlessly in the rough seas. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, but they didn't even know which haystack to look in. They knew K-129 had vanished, but the Pacific is 63 million square miles of water. Without a location, they were just chasing ghosts. The Americans watched this unfold with intense curiosity. U.S. Navy intelligence saw the sudden surge in Soviet traffic. They saw the unusual codes being transmitted. They realized the Russians were panicked. It didn't take long for the Office of Naval Intelligence to figure it out. The Soviets had lost a submarine, and judging by where they were looking, they had no idea where it was. But here's where the story shifts, because while the Soviets were looking at the surface, the Americans had been listening to the deep. Since the early days of the Cold War, the United States had been secretly laying thousands of miles of cables along the ocean floor. It was a system called SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System. It was a global network of underwater microphones designed to track Soviet submarines. The ocean carries sound over incredible distances. A whale song can travel across an ocean basin. An explosion travels even further. Naval technicians went back through the audio tapes from the weeks prior. They were looking for an anomaly, a sound that didn't belong. And they found it. On March 8th, sensors recorded a sharp, catastrophic acoustic event. It wasn't an earthquake, it wasn't a volcano. It was the sound of metal groaning and snapping. It was an implosion. When a submarine sinks past its crushed depth, the hull fails. The air inside is compressed instantly by the weight of the ocean. It happens faster than the human brain can process pain. The explosion was followed by a long, haunting thud as the wreckage hit the bottom. By triangulating the data from different microphones, the Americans did the math. They drew lines on a map. The lines crossed at a specific point in the central North Pacific, 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. The Soviets eventually gave up. After weeks of searching, they declared K-129 lost with all hands. They assumed the ocean had swallowed their secrets. They went home to mourn their dead, believing that their submarine was lost in the infinite void, safe from enemy hands because it was unreachable. They were wrong. The Americans knew exactly where the grave was, and they began to ask a question that should have been insane. What if we went down there? This wasn't just about curiosity. This was the holy grail of intelligence. K-129 was a time capsule of Soviet technology. Inside that crushed steel hull were codebooks, cryptographic machines, nuclear torpedoes, and those 3 ballistic missiles. If the U.S. could get their hands on those codebooks, they could read the Soviet Navy's mail. They could track their entire fleet. It would shift the balance of power overnight. But knowing where it was and getting to it were 2 very different things. The wreck was sitting at 16,500 feet. That is deeper than the Titanic. It is deeper than the height of Mount Rainier. At that depth, the water pressure is over 7,000 pounds per square inch. It's a hostile, alien world. In 1968, human beings had visited the bottom of the ocean fewer times than they would soon visit the moon. To even look at the wreck, they needed a special kind of ship. The Navy had just the tool: the USS Halibut. The Halibut was a strange beast. Originally a nuclear missile sub, it had been converted into a special operations spy vessel. It was fitted with thrusters that let it hover in place like a helicopter, and it carried a massive underwater robot, a fish tethered by miles of cable. This camera-equipped sled could be lowered into the abyss to take pictures. They called it Operation Sand Dollar. In the summer of 1968, the Halibut slipped out of Pearl Harbor. The crew was told a cover story. The real mission was known only to the captain and a handful of officers. They sailed to the coordinates provided by the acoustic data. For days, they trawled the bottom, dragging their camera sled through the darkness. The tension on the Halibut was suffocating. They were operating right under the noses of the Soviet fleet, looking for a tomb. And then, the cameras saw something. Grainy, black and white photos began to come up the wire. First, debris, twisted metal. Then, something distinct. A sail. A rudder. The shattered remains of K-129. The photos were chilling. They showed the wreckage of a war machine, but also the tragedy of 98 men. One photo, which would remain classified for decades, reportedly showed the skeleton of a sailor, still wearing his boots and winter gear, lying on the ocean floor. The Halibut returned with the proof. They had the location. They had the photos. They knew the condition of the sub. This information landed on the desk of the CIA, and this is where logic usually stops. A rational government would look at a 3 million pound steel object lying 3 miles deep and say, it's impossible to move. You have to understand the engineering challenge. It's like trying to lift a school bus from the top of the Empire State Building using a piece of thread in the middle of a hurricane without anyone seeing you do it. But the CIA in the late 60s and early 70s didn't operate on normal logic. They operated on unlimited budgets and paranoia. They looked at the photos of K-129 and they didn't see a tragedy. They saw an opportunity. They decided they weren't just going to take pictures. They weren't just going to use a robot to grab a codebook. No, they wanted the whole thing. They wanted to steal the submarine. But how? You can't just tow it. You can't send divers. And you certainly can't do it openly, because if the Soviets find out you are stealing their warship, they will consider it an act of war. It had to be a heist, the biggest, deepest, most expensive heist in human history. They needed a cover story, a lie so big, so audacious, that nobody would question it. They needed a reason to be out in the middle of the Pacific with a massive ship, digging around on the ocean floor. And to sell a lie that big, they needed a showman. Someone eccentric, someone reclusive, someone with more money than God and a reputation for doing crazy things. The CIA didn't go to a defense contractor. They didn't go to the Navy. They went to a hotel penthouse in Las Vegas. They went to Howard Hughes. Howard Hughes was the perfect mask. He was already known for his strange obsession with mining and aviation. If Howard Hughes said he was building a giant ship to mine manganese nodules from the ocean floor, people would laugh, call him crazy, and then believe him. And so, Project Azorian was born. The plan was terrifyingly complex. They would build a ship, a massive, custom-built vessel that looked like a mining ship. But inside it would be a floating fortress of spycraft. It would have a giant claw like an arcade game grabber, but capable of lifting millions of pounds. They would sail this ship right over the wreck, lower the claw on a pipe string 3 miles long, grab the submarine, and pull it up into a secret moon pool in the belly of the ship. It sounds like fiction. It sounds like something a writer would invent for a spy novel because it's too ridiculous to be true. But the checks were signed, the steel was ordered. The engineers began to draw the blueprints for a machine that shouldn't exist. The target was dead. The target was gone. But the Americans were coming to get it. The lie was perfect because it was boring. When the world looked at the Hughes Glomar Explorer, they didn't see a spy ship. They seen an ego trip. They saw Howard Hughes, a man known for losing his mind, spending a fortune to pick up rocks from the bottom of the ocean. The press called it a treasure hunt for manganese nodules, potato-sized rocks scattered on the sea floor that contained nickel and copper. It was a dull industrial excuse, and everyone bought it. While the newspapers ran stories about ocean mining, the CIA was building a mechanical monster in a shipyard in Pennsylvania. The Glomar Explorer wasn't just a ship, it was a floating skyscraper. It was 618 feet long, heavy, and ugly. But the real magic was hidden inside. The engineers faced a problem that physics said couldn't be solved. How do you lower a giant claw 3 miles down, grab a submarine that weighs as much as a destroyer, and pull it back up without the ocean snapping your line? You can't use a cable. A steel cable that long would snap under its own weight. So, they used pipe. Rigid, heavy steel pipe. The plan was to string it together section by section, like a chaotic plumbing project, reaching all the way down to the abyss. The ship had a massive derrick in the center, a tower that looked like an oil rig. But the most important feature was invisible from the outside. In the belly of the ship there was a hole, a massive, hollow chamber called the moon pool. It was a hangar bay with no floor, just the open ocean water lapping inside. This was where the prize would be hidden. The plan was to pull the Soviet submarine up from the dark, right into the stomach of the ship, out of sight of Russian satellites and passing vessels. Once it was inside, massive doors would close beneath it, draining the water and leaving the submarine sitting dry on the deck, ready to be dissected. And then there was the claw. The engineers called it Clementine. It was a massive steel structure, equipped with hydraulic fingers designed to wrap around the hull of the K-129. It looked like something from a nightmare, a skeletal hand waiting to snatch a soul.
For years, thousands of workers built this machine. They toiled in the sun, welding and riveting, having no idea what they were actually building. They thought they were making mining equipment. Only a tiny circle of men knew that this was a grave robber. By the summer of 1974, the ship was ready. It sailed around South America to the Pacific. The crew was a strange mix. You had rough-necked oil drillers who thought they were mining rocks, and you had mission specialists, said CIA operatives, quietly living among them, watching, waiting, The tension on board was a quiet hum, a vibration that never went away. On July 4th, 1974, the Glomar Explorer arrived at the site. The ocean was calm. The sun was beating down. But below them, 3 miles down, the K-129 was waiting. The operation began. This was the moment of truth. They opened the doors of the moon pool. They lowered Clementine into the water, and then began the longest, most nerve-wracking game of Tetris in history. They had to lower the pipe 60 feet at a time. A crane would pick up a section of pipe, screw it into the string, and lower it. Then another. Then another. It's a slow, rhythmic process. Clang. Hiss. Lower. Clang. Hiss. Lower. They did this for days. The pipe string got longer and heavier. As it went deeper, the currents began to push it. The ship on the surface was being tossed by waves, but the claw 3 miles down had to remain perfectly still. If the ship moved too much, the pipe would snap like a dry twig. To fix this, the ship had a computer system years ahead of its time. It used underwater transponders to triangulate its position and automatically fired thrusters to keep the ship hovering in the exact same spot, countering the wind and the waves. It was dynamic positioning, technology that is standard today but was science fiction in 1974. But the Soviets weren't blind. Just as the claw was getting close to the bottom, a Soviet tugboat appeared on the horizon. The SB-10. The bridge of the Glomar Explorer went silent. The CIA agents watched through binoculars as the Russian ship steamed closer. The Soviets were curious. They knew K-129 was somewhere in this area. They saw this massive American ship sitting idle in the middle of nowhere. The Soviet tug circled them. It came dangerously close. The Russian captain got on the radio. He asked what they were doing. The American captain stuck to the script. "Mining experiments," he said. "Testing equipment." The Russians watched. They took photos. On the deck of the Glomar, the crew tried to look casual. They waved. They played loud music. But beneath their feet, a 3-mile-long steel straw was dangling into the deep, and at the end of it was the very thing the Russians were looking for. If the Soviet captain had known what was happening directly under his keel, he would have rammed the Glomar Explorer. He would have cut the pipe. He would have started World War III right there in the Pacific swell. But the lie held. The mining cover story was just boring enough to be believable. The Soviet tug lingered for days, a constant, menacing shadow, before finally losing interest and steaming away. The crew breathed again, but the hard part was just starting. Clementine was now hovering just a few feet above the ocean floor. The camera feeds flickered to life in the control room. The operators stared at the grainy monitors. There it was. The ghost. The wreckage of K-129 lay broken in the silt. It was a tomb of steel. You could see the sail, the missile tubes, the shattered hull. It was a solemn sight. 98 men had died right there. But there was no time for sentiment. The operators adjusted the controls. The massive hydraulic fingers of the claw opened. They positioned it over the submarine. Slowly, agonizingly, they lowered it. The steel fingers dug into the mud. They wrapped around the hull. The hydraulics whined as they tightened their grip. Capture engaged. They had it. They had actually done it. They had grabbed a Soviet nuclear submarine from the bottom of the world. Now came the lift. Lifting a weight that heavy through water is a delicate dance. You can't just yank it. You have to pull gently, letting the water drain, managing the tension. The engines of the Glomar Explorer roared as they took the strain. The pipe groaned, the dials in the control room redlined. Inch by inch, the K-129 lifted off the bottom. The mud swirled, creating a cloud that obscured the cameras. For the first time in 6 years, the submarine was moving. It was coming up. The ascent was slow, painfully slow. Every 60 feet they had to stop, unscrew a section of pipe, and stack it on the deck. It was the reverse of the lowering process. Day turned into night. Night turned into day. The crew worked in shifts, fueled by coffee and adrenaline. They pulled it up a mile, then 2 miles. Everything was holding. The engineering miracle was working. The CIA chiefs back in Langley were preparing to pop the champagne. They were about to pull off the greatest intelligence coup in history. They were going to steal a nuclear sub, and the Russians would never know. But the ocean doesn't give up its dead easily. When the submarine was about halfway up, just over a mile from the surface, disaster struck. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a Soviet attack. It was a failure of materials. The K-129 had been hit hard when it crashed in 1968. The hull was cracked and weakened. As they pulled it up, the change in pressure and the stress of the lift proved to be too much. Inside the control room, the operators felt a shudder go through the ship. A sharp, violent vibration. The tension gauges on the lift pipe suddenly dropped. On the monitors, they saw a cloud of bubbles and debris. 3 of the grabber claws had cracked. They failed. The grip was broken. The men in the control room watched in horror as 2/3 of the submarine slipped out of the claw. The back half of the sub, the part containing the missile control center and the code room, broke away. It tumbled back into the darkness, spiraling down, falling back to the grave it had just left. Gone. All that was left in the claw was the front section. The nose. It was still hanging there, swinging gently in the current, a mile beneath the ship. The room was dead silent. The Triumph had turned into a catastrophe in the span of 3 seconds. They had lost the prize. Or had they? The mission commander looked at the screens. They still had the front section. They still had something. And they had come too far, spent too much money, and told too many lies to go home empty-handed. They continued the lift. What they brought to the surface wasn't the whole submarine, but what they found inside that broken nose section would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The ocean had kept the machine, but it had given back the men. As the remains of the K-129 rose toward the moon pool, the Hughes Glomar Explorer wasn't just a spy ship anymore. It was a hearse. The final act of this drama was about to play out, not in the Cold War room of the CIA, but in the radioactive steel silence of the moon pool. And the secret they were about to uncover was more human and more tragic than any codebook. The final few hundred feet were the hardest. The winches groaned. The steel cables were pulled taut, vibrating like the strings of a cello played by a giant. Inside the belly of the Glomar Explorer, the water in the massive moon pool began to churn. The crew gathered on the catwalks, looking down into the black water. They were wearing radiation badges and protective suits. The Geiger counters were already clicking. Then, it broke the surface. It didn't look like a submarine anymore. It looked like a piece of crushed scrap metal. It was covered in mud and slime, tangled in fishing nets that had snagged on it over the years. It was ugly. It smelled of the deep ocean, sulfur, salt, and decay. The massive doors beneath the ship slid shut. The pumps roared to life, draining the water from the moon pool. Slowly, the wreckage of K-129 was left high and dry on the deck. The CIA operatives moved in. They were the first human beings to touch this metal in 6 years. They approached it with blowtorches and saws, cutting into the twisted steel to see what they had actually caught. The disappointment was immediate. Because the submarine had snapped in half during the lift, the most valuable prizes were gone. The ballistic missiles, gone. The encryption room with the high-level codebooks, gone. They were lying in the mud a mile below, lost forever. What they had was the nose section, the torpedo room. They found 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes. This was a significant find. It gave American engineers a look at Soviet nuclear warhead design. They found some documents, manuals, and logs. It was an intelligence win. But it wasn't the jackpot they had spent hundreds of millions of dollars to get. It was like breaking into a bank vault and only finding the loose change in the teller's drawer. But as they cut deeper into the wreckage, they found something else. Something that stopped the work completely. They found the crew. 6 bodies. 6 Soviet sailors who had been at their posts in the torpedo room when the end came. You have to imagine the scene. Here you have CIA agents, men trained to view the Soviets as the ultimate enemy, staring at the remains of young men who were just like them. The Cold War was a war of ideologies, but in that moon pool, there was no ideology. There were just sailors who had died in the dark. The question arose, what do we do with them? A callous government might have disposed of them quietly, but the men on the Glomar Explorer were mariners, and mariners share a code that is older than any nation. You respect the dead. They cleaned the bodies, they placed them in metal caskets, and then, in one of the most surreal moments of the Cold War, the CIA held a formal military funeral for Soviet sailors on board a US spy ship. It was filmed. The footage is grainy and haunting. You see American sailors in dress uniforms standing at attention. The Soviet flag is draped over the coffins. The chaplain reads a prayer. And then, the ship's band plays the Soviet national anthem. The music echoed off the steel walls of the moon pool. For a few minutes, the war stopped. They tilted the ramp, and the coffins slid one by one back into the ocean. They returned them to the deep, not as enemies, but as fellow sailors. It was a secret act of honor that wouldn't be revealed to the world or to the families of those Russian boys for nearly 20 years. The Glomar Explorer turned around and headed for Hawaii. The mission was over. They had spent the equivalent of $4 billion in today's money. They had built a ship that defied physics, and they had recovered a fraction of what they wanted. The CIA wanted to go back. They actually drew up plans for a second mission, Project Matador, to go get the rest of the sub. But secrets are hard to keep. Back on land, a different kind of breach was happening. In June 1974, thieves broke into the offices of the Summa Corporation, Howard Hughes' company. They cracked the safe. They were looking for cash, but they found memos, secret memos describing a CIA project to steal a Russian submarine. The thieves didn't know what they had, so they tried to blackmail the CIA. It was a mess. The story began to leak. Investigative journalist Jack Anderson got wind of it. The New York Times got wind of it. The CIA director, William Colby, personally pleaded with the media not to publish the story. He argued that if the story got out, it would humiliate the Soviet Union and force them to retaliate. He said it was a matter of national security. For a while, the press held their tongue, but in March 1975, the story broke. The headline ran across the world. CIA salvage ship brought up part of Soviet sub lost in 1968. The cover was blown. The mining for manganese nodules story collapsed. The world stared in disbelief. The sheer audacity of the operation was staggering. People couldn't decide whether to be angry at the waste of money or impressed by the engineering. The White House was bombarded with questions. Reporters demanded to know, did you steal the sub? What did you find? Is it true? And this gave birth to a phrase that is still used today. The CIA couldn't admit it, because that would be a diplomatic disaster. But they couldn't deny it, because they would be lying, and the evidence was out there. So, they created a new kind of answer. They issued a statement saying, we can neither confirm nor deny the existence of the materials to which you refer. It was the birth of the Glomar response. a non-answer, a way to say nothing while saying everything. The Soviets were furious. They accused the Americans of piracy. They sailed their own ships to the site and threatened to destroy any future attempts. The second mission was cancelled. The rest of K-129, along with its missiles and the remaining 92 crew members, was left in the dark, where it remains to this day. So, what was it all for? Project Azorian is often called a failure because they dropped the prize. But that misses the point. The fact that they tried it all is the story. It proved that there was nowhere on Earth the United States couldn't reach. It forced the Soviets to realize that their invincible deep-sea fleet was vulnerable. It changed the way the ocean was surveilled forever. The Hughes Glomar Explorer spent the next few decades drifting from owner to owner. It was eventually converted into a deep-sea drilling ship. It was stripped of its spy gear, its claw, and its moon pool. It ended its life in a scrapyard in China in 2015, cut up for razor blades. But the story remains. It is a reminder of a time when the world was on the edge, and when men were willing to do the impossible just to peek at the other player's cards. Down in the North Pacific, the silence has returned. The pressure is still 7,000 pounds per square inch. The darkness is total. The K-129 rests in the silt, a monument to the Cold War's ambition and its tragedy. The target was gone. Then it was found. Then it was stolen. And finally, it was returned to the only place that can truly keep a secret. The deep.